Hello, and welcome to this month's International Compliance Association LinkedIn Live event that is today going to focus on the regulatory challenges concerned with the use of cryptocurrencies. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Maria Malaros Santa Maria. And we're going to together explore the landscape involving virtual assets, thinking about the different types of assets that this involves. And then we're going to be thinking about how the EU in particular and the wider regulatory landscape is evolving in response to these new products and services that, of course, so many of us will be familiar with. So, Maria, can I bring you into the conversation? It's lovely to see you again. And before we do what I've just said, can I suggest that, or can I just offer you the opportunity to briefly introduce yourself and explain why you're here today?
Hello, Tim. Again, it's good to speak with you and with everyone today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Maria Milagros Santa Maria. I am a lawyer originally from Argentina, living now in Portugal for a couple of years. And I am a Web3 legal consultant, currently working as a compliance coordinator and partly officer in an investment fund here in Portugal and family office, as well as helping in different Web3 projects as legal department, and partly coordinator of Crecimiento, a movement in Argentina to enhance or provide more financial stability and abundance by the potential creation of a new sandbox or special economic zone happening in 10 to 20 years. Mostly, and as a summary and easier for everyone, I'm a legal Web3 consultant.
Okay, thank you. And if I may, I'll call you Maria today. We first met, didn't we, some weeks ago, and we were talking about this subject of the particular challenges around just understanding the nature of the services and the way in which regulation is having to evolve in response to that. And at the time, we thought, wouldn't it be useful to share some of this with other LinkedIn colleagues around the world who I hope offer some insight to these issues. And before we talk about the nature of the regulation, could I ask you to sort of broadly explain what the landscape looks like? I mean, there are so many different terms being used: virtual assets, non-fungible tokens, tokenization, of course, virtual currencies, stablecoin. What does this landscape look like, Maria?
Absolutely. So we have two ways of looking at it. Either we can see it from a European point of view on what regulations exist on this matter, or we can go country by country in Europe, and we can see that different levels of regulation can happen. You have countries like Portugal, where I'm currently living, that is not as advanced as other countries, like, for example, France or Germany, especially when it comes to the use of DLT, distributed ledger technologies, and how they've added into their legislative processes. From a European point of view, we can realize what kind of regulations apply to us or Web3 projects, depending on the kind of tokens that we are handling or issuing, and the kind of activities or operations that we perform. From that point of view, we can divide ourselves within MiCA regulated, or that falls within the scope of MiCA, or outside of it. And MiCA itself, or crypto assets, markets in crypto assets, it's a European regulation that therefore applies to every country within Europe, and that the first enforceability is going to happen now the 30th of June, and the second one by end of this year, therefore the 1st of January, applies to different kind of tokens and as well to different kind of operations, all related to distributed ledger technologies, or more specifically to blockchain. But we're talking about the tokens that fall within the scope of MiCA. And if I do step behind and we define a token as a digital representation of something that's within the blockchain, both a digital representation of an asset or a non-asset, my diploma as a lawyer can be tokenized. It can be put as an input inside of a blockchain to represent it, but it wouldn't be a crypto asset, but could still be a token. When we talk about how MiCA regulates this kind of tokens, it goes specifically to stable coins, or even more to e-money tokens or ad reference tokens. And why do we make this difference? Because when we speak about tokens, we can define them by their taxonomy on the intrinsic nature of what is being tokenized. We can talk about payment tokens that are stable or non-stable. Non-stable, as an example, Bitcoin or Ethereum, are stable, those tokens that somehow have a stable value referenced by something. In this, we have USDT or USDC or DAI as example of stable tokens. And MiCA divides them in two. In stable tokens that are e-money tokens, therefore their value becomes stable by always being pegged or glued to fiat currency, like a euro, or in the case of USDC, one token is always going to be $1. Or we can talk about asset reference tokens, which also keep a stable value by a combination of different values put together as an algorithm or other ways that always has a little bit of a fiat currency in it to try to keep and maintain that stability. So going back, when we're in a European level, MiCA, markets in crypto assets, would apply to the issuance and as well custody or different kind of operations related to stable coins, divided in EMTs, e-money tokens, or ART, asset reference tokens. Beyond this, other kind of tokens also fall within the scope of MiCA, but by exclusion. And these are utility tokens. And we're talking about the kind of tokens that reference the right to a good or a service or an access to something. A token that might reference the tickets to an event or a bottle of wine, which already happens, or other kind of services that we can mention, both digital or non-digitals. The important thing about this is that as tokens can be hybrid, the analysis of their taxonomy, therefore what they represent, and also the effect of their transference or negotiability, is what's going to help us understand whether they fall within MiCA or outside of the scope of MiCA. And outside of the scope of MiCA, we might be talking about either NFTs, non-fungible tokens, and the word fungibility is the most important one, because when we understand that we can swap one thing with the other, asset with the other, without having a problem like exchanging a note of 10 for 2 coins of 5 that is fungible, is what is going to make us understand whether it might fall inside or outside of MiCA. So outside of MiCA are those tokens that have a unique trait and they're not fungible with other kind of assets or things. So this falls outside of the scope of MiCA, but also security tokens, which is also part of this taxonomy that we're explaining. That is the digital representation, and encrypted as well, of a financial asset, either digital or non-digital. In this case, and also speaking about the overall regulatory landscape on DLTs in Europe, when we're talking about security tokens, we don't have a MiCA of its own, not yet at least. We have got the understanding that if we're talking about either a financial instrument that's tokenized or a service related to financial services that is anchored or leveraged on blockchain, then we're going to have to think about MiFID II. And then how each country in the union has a specific regulation for it or not. Germany does, as the example that I gave. Even Germany... Sorry?
Can I jump in there? It's fascinating listening to you, Maria. Thank you. But can I just draw on some of the strands of what you've touched upon and try and make some sense of the landscape that we're describing. And I think one way to do that, which you've explained, is by reference to the distributed ledger or the blockchain. Exactly. So all of these things that you're describing now, and you've touched on utility tokens, security tokens, e-money tokens. Of course, you've also touched on NFTs. You've touched on currencies themselves and stablecoin. All of these have one thing in common, and that is that they are captured, recorded, and transacted using the blockchain ledger. And this, of course, is relatively new. It's been around for 12 years, 13 years. Originally brought to us by the founders of Bitcoin, but we find that the same ledger or the same technology can be used in a variety of different ways. And you've touched on some of those ways. What they all have in common, though, is that it's through the use of the blockchain. Is that a fair analysis?
Absolutely. When we're talking about blockchain, we're not only talking about Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. We're talking about a special type of technology, a distributed ledger technology that's also decentralized with core characteristics that could be applied to infinite ideas or projects or many industries. We're talking about transparency, traceability, the immutability of the ledger itself, and then about the possibility of using smart contracts for the automation of many transactions and interactions of different agents, replacing the necessity of trust between the agents with the trust that we have in the technology. This is the reason why blockchain itself appeared with the white paper of Bitcoin as a decentralized payment network, that because of these core characteristics, it helps to replace the intermediaries, which would be financial intermediaries or the bank, because you no longer need this third party for the certification of the information or the transaction itself. This could be applied to so much.
So what this means, of course, is then the peer-to-peer transactions can take place without the intermediaries, as you point out. And that's not confined to virtual or crypto or digital currencies. And it is confusing because we're using different words to describe what is pretty much the same thing. This can take place peer-to-peer, and that same technology can underpin contracts, it can underpin records, public records, a whole variety of different activities. And I think you touched on Web3, which of course is one way in which we're describing the disruption of blockchain and the way that it's going to have an impact on so much that we're doing currently using the internet. Is that a fair description?
Absolutely, it is. Because in the end, this kind of technology is a revolution or disruption of the back end of all the code, the numbers that we don't see, and that in the end, we might be interacting with them without noticing. Because we see the front end, we see the picture in the laptop, we see the UX UI design. And many times we're interacting with this kind of technology without even knowing it. Many banks are already utilizing it for transactions to make them faster and safer. And even when we utilize AI, like ChatGPT, I recently learned that they tokenize at the moment of digesting the information, words or set of words to make it faster as well. So in the end, it's not so much that blockchain or AI or these technologies out of the future. They're actually part of our present and our everyday lives, but we're normalizing them and we're starting to use them more and more as useful tools.
So if I can then, just to take this then forward, what you've described is a variety of different uses of the blockchain. And I think you've mentioned that some are captured within the regulation for those within the EU of MiCA.
Exactly.
And others fall outside of MiCA. Is that, and what is it that would bring these assets or representations on the blockchain within MiCA, within the scope of MiCA? And can you just explain again, what is MiCA? So lots of questions there, but can you pick up on those?
Absolutely. So a summary of it, or in a nutshell, would be that markets in crypto assets, the European regulation that applies to stable coins, ARTs and e-money tokens, utility tokens as well, and crypto asset service providers, therefore those entities or projects that provide a service related to blockchain. And those tokens or activities that fall out of the scope are those related to NFTs, always that the NFT is not considered a stable token anyway, or a utility token, and related to financial instruments or financial services.
So what is MiCA then? Talk us through this. You mentioned,
please continue. MiCA, it's markets in crypto assets, is the regulation of the European Union that applies to to the 27 countries in the issuance of stablecoins or utility tokens, and for the provision of crypto asset services to projects that work with blockchain as a leverage of the services that they provide.
So this then regulates those different products that you've just touched upon. What does that mean in practice? Is that going to mean any difference in the way in which we use them, experience them?
So in practice, you can divide it in two. From the experience of the user and or consumer, and then from the experience of the company or the Web3 project itself. For the Web3 project, after they understand if they work with tokens, what's the taxonomy, the type of token they're going to issue, they can see what kind of requirements they're going to have to comply with MiCA, whether they're going to require just to notify or an authorization or what kind of prudential requirements. And as well to understand if they don't issue any kind of tokens, if the services that they provide requires them the license of a CASP, of a crypto asset service provider. So that is a start, depending on the token or on the service that they're actually performing. Then from the point of view of an investor or a consumer is to feel safe and to know that they can interact with the platform or with a token, always that they have been compliant with the company that would be the issuer or the one performing the service, that they're being compliant either with the license or the white papers or the other requirements that come. So it brings more legal certainty for every party, for the regulator, for the Web3 project, and as well for the investor that wants to invest in that project, and the consumer that wants to feel safer and less confused at the moment of interacting with Web3 as an ecosystem.
That's really helpful. And I think it's worth saying that the UK, for those that join from the UK and other countries around the world who are outside of the EU, there are different stages in terms of how they are looking to regulate digital assets and those various different products that you mentioned. But the likelihood is that the EU has set the standard, and we will start to see other countries starting to fall into line, either the same or very similar to this approach. Is that a fair summary?
That would be a really fair summary as well, because it's not only MiCA that we bear in mind, but there's another set of rules. There's MiFID II that applies to financial instruments and financial services, and there's not a MiCA that applies to that in DLT. But there's currently a sandbox, a regulatory space where different projects can apply, called DLT pilot regime, where they can start testing these technologies related to security tokens and financial services leveraged on blockchain and all of its characteristics. So in that sense, we can see that the European Union really has the intention of trying to regulate without killing innovation, which can be a real challenge. But I also can see or believe that the results of this new regulation, MiCA, and the ones to come, is going to be seen in upcoming years. Because then, as another example, companies can only apply to this kind of license as of the 1st of January of next year, of 2025.
Okay. So we're not far from running out of time, and I feel that we've only just started to scratch the surface of what is, of course, a big and quite challenging issue that many of us face, particularly those of us that are working in financial services. I'd like in a moment to ask you, Maria, just for some practical advice around how we respond to, for instance, customers that are making reference to digital assets within the context of source of funds and source of wealth. Before I do that, though, can I just quickly summarize where I think we've got to within this discussion? And then I'll invite you just to look at some very practical takeaways that we can finish with. But we've talked then about what is a radical change. Some of this we're not necessarily going to see immediately, but this is a change in the infrastructure that allows us to transact, that allows us to do business. You've described it as Web3, which I think is one way of just capturing how significant this is. And it is enabled through this idea of the blockchain that can drive, can automate can record and establish trust around a variety of different transactions, services, products, activities, whether they're tickets for a concert, bottles of wine, money, non-fungible tokens. If we have them longer, we could talk about what they are, currencies, and so the list continues. And you've just touched on the fact that this needs some kind of organization. We need to build trust in the way in which these are being promoted, the way in which we are interacting with them, and the way in which they're being sold. And that's one of the drivers for the EU to introduce the MiCA regulations. And you've touched on what that means in practice. So I hope that's a useful summary of what we've covered over the last 15 or so minutes. But perhaps we can just finish with some practical ideas about, for those of us within financial services, maybe just used to dealing with fiat currencies and the various products and services that we've grown up with. What do we do when our customers start to talk about these types of products in the context of, for instance, customer due diligence, or in the context of source of funds, source of wealth? How can we get confidence in this?
So there are different points of view that you can take that from. As an example, if we consider that a regulated exchange that therefore has a license operates correctly, it would mean that if a person or a consumer interacts with that entity or that exchange, they're going to know that they're already performing the AML different analysis that they have to do for the person to buy and sell and feel safe from that point of view. From another point of view, as well, of just the user or the consumer on its own, if we remember that the core characteristics of blockchain are transparency, traceability, and the mutability of the ledger, and we take out a misconception, which is that blockchain provides anonymity, and we replace it with the word pseudonymity, we understand that every transaction that is made is traceable and open source for everyone to find. On that sense, I might not know the name and the last name of the person unless we can link the wallet to an exchange, but we can trace the wallet itself, which means that utilizing blockchain as a type of technology and other tools that exist like Etherscan, that would be the blockchain Google, that you can put the transaction, you can put a smart contract, you can put a wallet, and it's going to trace up to the very beginning of its creation. We can show people that they can go back to the source of any kind of fund put in any kind of wallet. It could be too much as raw information. So what consumers or especially Web3 projects do to be more careful on AML and CFT is to work with already existing companies that analyze all this data and can classify the source of the funds or the transaction as red, orange, or green, depending on the level of risk. Companies like this, an example is called Chain Analysis. Chain Analysis is a kind of company that works with Web3 projects at the moment of analyzing the money that comes and the money that goes, making a very good digestion of every movement that has been done and analyzing time zones and geographical nuances as well to see how dangerous the money can be. So if we interact with an entity that's already licensed, we can have the safety that they, in theory, they should be doing correctly the AML and the CFT procedures and KYC. And from a point of view of myself as a consumer or wanting to have my own Web3 project, to leverage myself in other tools, either on my own for the digestion of the information or already existing companies like Chain Analysis that can help me identify better this information and decision making.
Okay. Maria, thank you so much. I feel that, again, we've just started to alight on some of the issues. And I expect that those of us that are working in financial services or some wider regulated activities will see more and more of this over the coming months and years, and will become part of our taxonomy, part of our thinking and day-to-day activity. But in the meantime, Maria, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. And for those that have joined us via LinkedIn, thank you for your time, for your interest. We do hope that this has been of some value, some use to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim, and everyone.